Howdy! Welcome or welcome back. My name is Ari, and the Goodreads Choice Awards have finally been announced. Now, we're talking about the fantasy category today because I've read all 20 of the fantasy books. I did predict the winner. Amina is kind of obvious. But I did predict the winner. It's Hellbent by Leigh Bardugo. But let's start at the bottom. And I'm going to go through every single one of these books, tell you what I thought about it, if I agree with other readers here on Goodreads, and if you should pick it up. Are any of these books actually worth reading? So let's start at the bottom. Last place is Vinco by Sherry Dimeline. I probably butchered that. That's all right. I agree with this. This was my number 20 book too. I 100% agree with this being last place. Vinco is a book about a young lady named Lucky St. James, and she's surviving, barely. Her mother has died. Her grandmother is starting to lose her memory, starting to forget things. She's got fairly advanced dementia, and Lucky is barely scraping by as far as money goes. And they're about to be evicted from their apartment. And she's worried that she's gonna have to put her grandmother in a home because she can't afford this already cheap apartment that they have. What is she gonna do? Hundreds of miles away in Salem, Massachusetts, a coven has been forming for the past, I don't know how many years, I don't care. Basically, a spell was put on a bunch of spoons, and each witch finds a spoon and then has a certain amount of time that gets shorter and shorter and shorter between each witch, where they have to find the next witch, and then the 7 witches have to come together after finding their spoons, form a coven, and defeat this male coven of witches who the patriarchy is trying to bring them down. Lucky is obviously the 6th witch, and we have multiple perspectives between her and then a lady named Myrna Good, I believe, who is the 1st witch in the Coven of Witches. This was awful. First off, I don't like witches. I don't like that they're all stereotypically Salem witches. And then, like, in everything about this book was just entirely cliche. There were some perspectives from the male character, like the bad man witch, and it was so disgusting and rapey. And this whole book was like, women are good, men are evil, and it was cliche. It was lame, it was bad. I don't think anybody should read this. But yeah. Unless you really, really like witches and really, 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 really want a very cliche witch story, just skip this one. It's not worth your time. You've read it before. Next up, we have Martha Wells' Witch King, which I don't agree with. This was in my top 10. This was number 5 for me. I think it's so low because when people read Martha Wells, they expect Murderbot, which is A, sci-fi, and B, super sarcastic. And this is more like high fantasy with a completely original fantasy world that isn't like the silly sci-fi that you get with Murderbot. This is also like 400 pages, and Murderbot are novellas, and they're like 100 pages long. So Martha Wells fans won't necessarily be into this, and then people who aren't Martha Wells fans probably wouldn't pick this up because they expect it to be like Murderbot. So that's my guess why it's not popular. I don't know. I liked it. This follows a witch, a dude witch named Kai, and Kai was murdered, but he's not very good at staying dead. He kind of like wakes up and finds some mage trying to harness his powers, and he was like, yeah, funny, and then kind of takes over that mage's body, and then wakes up his friend that's buried with him. And then he and his other friend are kind of like, hey, why the fuck were we killed? What is going on? And they set off an adventure to find out what happened to them, why the rest of their friends have not come to rescue them, and who among their friend group probably betrayed them. And that's pretty much it. It's high fantasy, set mostly in like a desert-ish area. Like I said, it is nothing like anything I've ever read before. I wouldn't begin to know a comp for this book. You are thrown into the middle of the story and you kind of have to figure out what's going on as you go. But I know some fantasy readers like it, some fantasy readers don't. You know your taste better than I know your taste. So if you know you don't want to be overwhelmed having no idea what's going on, maybe this isn't the book for you. The story is told in like 2 parts. You've got Kai in the future and now, and then Kai in the past, and like how those events overlap with each other. Like I said, I really enjoyed this. I don't think it should be this low. It's worth it. It's a worthy read from me. You can figure out if it sounds good to you or not. Next up, we have Victory City by Salman Rushdie. I agree with this being at the bottom. This was my second lowest. This was number 19 for me. So I agree with this book's placing. It was awful. This book sounds so good. The synopsis sounds so good. Hidden in a clay pot is a scroll of a forgotten empire. It's this long, epic poem fantasy tale. In the 14th century, in the south of India, a young girl watches her mother burn, and as this happens, she's like inspired and is filled with the power of a goddess. Because of this power, she ends up living 500 years and she becomes the queen of this empire. And she goes in and out, becoming the queen and becoming disliked, and just all this adventure of 500 years of this woman's life. Her name's Pampa Kampana. Just all of this is amazing. It sounds amazing. The problem with this book is, instead of this book being this super epic poetry, the poem is found by a Western trained scholar, and the book is told like this man is writing a school report on the contents of this scroll. And so you take this beautifully written epic by a woman and turn it into a book report by a boring Western, I don't know if he's Western, but at least a Western trained man. And it just saps all of the life and the fun out of the story, and it reads like nonfiction. And if I wanted to read nonfiction, I would read nonfiction. That's my entire problem, is how this story is told. I hated it. Next up, we have The Last Tale of the Flower Bride. And unlike Victory City, this is told in the most beautiful, musical way of telling a story. The writing in here was one of the most beautiful things I've read in a long time. This is like on the par of like Addie LaRue or The Starless Sea. Like, just the writing, immaculate. This is a like gothic inspired, I would say, story where this man and woman get married, but she has a bunch of secrets, and she was like, I will marry you, I want to be with you, but you can't ever ask me about my past. And you can't ever try to discover it on your own. Like, my past is off limits. That's just a stipulation of the marriage. He's a scholar, she's an heiress, and she learns her aunt is dying and has to go home and like take care of that. And while they're visiting her aunt, he starts to learn about her past, and like shit hits the fan. Atmosphere, writing, all amazing. The problem I have with this is very specific to me. And that is how this relationship works out. Like, this is the most codependent relationship I have ever read. And it's just like, ew, I don't want this in my story. So I just hated their relationship and how, like, their worlds wouldn't exist without each other, and they can't function outside of being together, and their entire personality is each other. As we unravel Indigo's past, we learn that this codependency has been something that's happened her entire life. Is she is codependent with him now, but she also had a codependent relationship as a child with another young girl. It's not my jam. I don't like it. So I agree, this was number 18 on my list. I agree that it'd be this low on the list. So far, Goodreads people are agreeing with me. But that ends now with Atalanta by Jennifer Saint. I put this as number 3 on my list. I love this story. I love how Jennifer Saint retells Greek myths. This follows Atalanta, who is a Grecian princess, but her father wanted a son, and so he just like left her on a hillside to die. He's like, screw this, I don't want a girl, dead baby, let's have fun. But Atalanta was raised by a mother bear, but eventually adopted by the goddess Artemis and raised in like a sacred forest with a bunch of nymphs to become this like world-class warrior in honor of Artemis. Then Artemis hears about the Argonauts' quest to get the Golden Fleece, and she wants a mortal to represent her as a goddess, so she sends Atalanta to join the Argonauts. And most of this book is the story of the Argonauts and how Atalanta was an integral part of the Argonauts, but as men retell the story that we know today, they frequently left her out because she's a woman. Who cares? But I love how Jennifer Saint retells Greek fiction and makes the women like strong and powerful, and it's they had amazing accomplishments. It's just the retelling of the stories that have been passed down that is the bad, that is icky and misogynistic, not the actual events. And I like how she retells that. And I really like the story, so I put this at number 3 on my list. It is 16 on Goodreads list. So if you like Greek retellings and you want a little bit more of a feminist side to your retelling, pick this one up. It's better than the other ones on here. Next up at number 11 is The Will of the Many by James Islington. And it's not that low on my personal list. I have it at 11 on my list. So not top 10, but not as low as Goodreads have it. And really, my only problem with this is it just wasn't for me. This follows a teenager named Vis. He was orphaned after his parents were killed, and then gets adopted by a rich person to join this military academy for all like the really smart rich kids. He was raised outside of this society as like a young prince, and that's why he's so smart and so capable, but no one knows who like everybody thought he died with his parents, so he's able to sneak back into society and kind of become a rebel, maybe a little bit unwilling. Like he hates the society, but hates it for personal reasons and doesn't really want to help anybody else. He just wants to help himself, but he kind of gets like looped in to rebelling, mostly not by his choice. If you like Red Rising, this is extremely like Red Rising. Like, it's really like Red Rising. This one's just a little bit more fantasy than the sci-fi of Red Rising, but the story's the same. Yeah, it's the same story. Sorry, it's the same story. I got some bad vibes from this. Mostly, if you're on the internet a lot, you've known that like all men think about the Roman Empire, and this is like all Roman Empire. And it gave me like the ick vibes because of that. Because if you're not aware, there was like this joke on TikTok that all men think about the Roman Empire every single day. And it turns out it's not all men, but a lot of the men who do are big fans of toxic masculinity. So anything to do with the Roman Empire and the idea of its association with modern toxic masculinity kind of gives me the ick a little bit. The other thing is the magic system is like word for word copied from Brandon Sanderson's Warbreaker. Like the names of the magic are exactly the same. Like in the end, it doesn't end up being very much like Warbreaker other than the copying of the magic system, but it was kind of like a, because Warbreaker's not a new book. This one wasn't for me, but it wasn't bad. It was just a straight up mid book as far as I'm concerned. If it sounds interesting to you, read it. If it doesn't, you're not missing out anything by not reading it. Next up, we have Clymmenra by Constanza Cassidy, and I agree with this. I put this at 14. This is exactly where it belongs. This follows the life of Queen Clymmenra, the wife of Agamemnon, and the sister of Helen. So if you're trying to place where this goes in Greek lore, it's the Trojan War, the Iliad. My opinion on this is Jennifer Saint did this story last year with Electra, and I like Jennifer Saint's version better. This one is more sad. Like, a bunch of awful stuff happened to Clymmenra and she had no agency in it. It's just, this was the society she lived in. This is the awful stuff that happened. Too bad women were treated like shit in Greek culture. The end. This one also treats the Greek pantheon as if it doesn't exist. Like, they're made up people in the sky as how we would view them today. So this one reads more like historical fiction than fantasy, because there's no real gods or goddesses. This is just what happened to the woman Clymmenra in the real world, but in antiquity, instead of there being any sort of like fantastical twist on it. I thought it was fine. I didn't have anything like super wrong with it. I just liked Electra better. And we are starting to get into like the section where it's like, yeah, it was fine. So I'm gonna say that about a whole lot of books coming up. It is wild how accurately I predicted this, because at number 13, Goodreads has Inkblood Sister Scribe, and so do I. And I wasn't trying to predict these. This is like my opinions. So I have the opinion of the masses. Inkblood Sister Scribe follows the Kalate family, who has guarded a collection of ancient rare books. They're magical. They can like suck your soul out if you touch them wrong. They're definitely something that shouldn't be just out there in the greater population. It follows two sisters. You've got Joanna and Esther. Esther's kind of cursed. She has to run all the time. She can't stay anywhere for more than a year. And currently she's in Antarctica. And then Joanna is isolated and just takes care of the books, pretty much stays behind wards as much as she possibly can, and doesn't really interact. Joanna doesn't know that Esther has fled because she is cursed. She just thinks that her sister wants nothing to do with her and ran away as a child. Then of course, there's bad guys out there who want their books, and then the sisters have to work together to protect their books, their family, their legacy, etc., etc., etc. This one was fine. It is sapphic, so if you're looking for queer fantasy, this definitely has this. I thought the first half of the book was boring, and then it picked up and got better towards the end. I don't really have anything good or bad to say about this. This was like truly just middle of the line mediocre. Next up at 12, Goodreads has The Book That Wouldn't Burn by Mark Lawrence. I, surprisingly, because I don't like Mark Lawrence as a person, had this ranked up at 6. I thought this was a really good book, but mostly because it was about libraries, and I like weird libraries. I can't help it. So this follows two separate characters who seem to be in like different universes. They're definitely not related to each other as far as we could tell, but one is a young boy who has lived his entire life trapped in a library. There's no windows, the doors won't open. There's a pool of water and some crops in the very middle, and he and generations of his ancestors have lived trapped in this library. Every few years or so, a young child will go missing. As the last child goes missing, the library has been invaded by the enemy. It has a word, but I can't remember it. And everybody is killed, and then these 5 missing children are dumped back into the library, into this room, generations, years and years and years later, and they all are like experts in one specific subject, and then they're just kind of growing up from there, right? The boy is one of these missing children. Then we have a girl who grew up outside of the city that contains the library. She grew up in what's called the Dust, and the enemy shows up at the beginning of the book and destroys all of her village and kidnaps the children. And then she is saved and then brought into the city. She's given the opportunity to become a librarian at this library. It's a whimsical library. Like, you could go from room to room and room, spend days if not years wandering around. There's no real catalog. It's a library of one copy of every single book that's ever existed in the world, if that tells you how whimsical it is. You could destroy a book and then it will be replaced on the shelf, and there's never more than one copy of any book. So it's like a weird place. It's constantly changing. There's traps, there's creatures. The enemy is going to take over the city and everything's going to go bad, and it just kind of like goes from there. There's also portals to other realms. It's a weird story. So while I don't like Mark Lawrence as a human being, we've established that many times, I really like the story. I'm not going to read any more in the series unless it shows up on like Goodreads again in the future. But I liked this book. Now at number 11, Goodreads has Stoneblind by Natalie Haynes. I had Stoneblind at 15. So a little bit higher ranked on Goodreads than my personal taste. But this is a Medusa retelling. So the third and final of the Greek myth retellings on this list. It follows the story of Medusa through a bunch of different eyes. So you have like Medusa telling part of the story, you have Perseus telling part of the story, and then you have like random other people, and it feels like these different stories are collected by a singular person to like tell Medusa's story from a bunch of different lenses and how other people see the events of this mythological story. I do love the writing style of this book. I love the short chapters of it, and I think the way this book is told makes for like a wonderful way to tell a story. I also enjoy that the Greek heroes and Greek gods are portrayed as incompetent children, because they kind of were incompetent children if you think about the stories, right? They're very entitled, and their entitlement shows through. Unfortunately, the thing I didn't like about this book is while all of these men gods are incompetent children, their incompetence still wins. They take what they want from women's bodies, and it's just not a pleasant thing to read about. I don't like when my escapism so closely mimics the events of real life. And while I understand that the amount of sexual assault that happens in this book is perfectly reasonable for Greek mythology, that still doesn't make it enjoyable, if that makes sense. There's not, like, I love the way the story is told, I just don't like the actual story itself. If stuff that bothers me doesn't bother you, you might really like this book. Halfway there at 10, we have The Unmaking of June, Pharaoh by Adrienne Young. Again with this book, the reason I don't like it is entirely me and nothing to do with the book itself. I put this at 17. Not 10, 17. The Pharaoh line of women is cursed. At some point during a Pharaoh woman's life, she's gonna start seeing things and kind of living in her own universe, and everybody around her thinks she's going crazy. And June's like, you know what? I'm sick of this. I'm the last person that this is going to happen to, because I am going to not have kids. Like, I desperately want children, but I'm not gonna have kids, so this curse ends, right? And we find out that maybe June's not crazy, maybe the Pharaoh woman can time travel. And then their memories are getting all mixed up with each other because of their time travel. And June travels back in time to the 1950s and falls in love. This has the vibes of like a mystical Nicholas Sparks novel or a Hallmark movie, but magic. It's got practical magic vibes, or, you know, the Lake House, Sandra Bullock movie. Sandra Bullock could definitely play June's mother, because she's not young enough to play June Pharaoh anymore. Whatever. Not important. Writing's good. I don't like kids or love stories. Or at least calm, happy love stories. I want fairy smut, not fall in love with a farmer in the 1950s and have a baby. Like, it's not my vibe. Book's fine. It's very well written. It's just not my vibe. Then at number 9, Starling House by Alex E. Harrow. Now, if you've seen any content I've made on any Goodreads Choice of Worlds, I hate Alex E. Harrow's writing. Me and her, we just don't get along. We don't get along. So you will be surprised to know that this is the best Alex E. Harrow book that I've ever read, and I put this at number 8. So I did a spot higher than Goodreads even gave us. So this is gothic. This should have been in the horror category. Just straight up, honestly, this should have been in the horror category. Follows a young woman named Opal in this town called Eden, Kentucky, and the town's just known for having bad luck and also like a haunted mansion called the Starling House. Opal has been obsessed with Starling House her entire life, and she's just kind of drawn to the house. And then she gets a job being a housekeeper at Starling House, and then she kind of falls for the current owner of the Starling House, whose name is Arthur, I think. And he's just like a grumpy dude. Her and her brother are living out of a hotel room. She's trying to put her brother through school, and will do anything to get some money. So that's why she agrees to work at Starling House. And then she kind of falls in love with Arthur along the way, and they figure out the curse of Starling House, and things happen from there. This is a good book. It's a good story. It's horror though. This is not fantasy. This is horror. So if you want to read a horror book, sure. Number 8. They have The Adventures of Amina AlSurfi by Shannon Chakraborty. I had this book at number 10, so fairly close, but not exactly dead on. So Amina is actually an elderly woman. She's not that old. She's like in her 40s. She has had a fabulous career sailing the Indian Ocean, but she got pregnant and had a baby, and so she retired from pirating to raise her daughter. She also might be married to a demon and needs to hide their demon daughter from Demon Daddy. I'm so glad I got to say Demon Daddy right there. A obscenely rich mother of one of her former crewmen shows up and says, hey, this guy that was one of your favorite crewmen, his daughter's been kidnapped, and I'm gonna pay you like $1 million to go save her. So go do that. And this is just like a fun adventure on sailing the high seas of the Indian Ocean and meeting a bunch of Indian mystical creatures. It's fun. Why is it ranked kind of right in the middle for me? Because I don't like kids. We've established this. I don't like kids. I also don't like pirates. So ocean pirates, children, it's just not doing it for me. But I appreciate, like, overall I appreciate this fantasy world. I like the Middle Eastern setting of it instead of like a European-based fantasy. I like that the character is an older woman and not some super experienced 17-year-old assassin pirate lady. At 7, Goodreads has Swordcatcher by Cassandra Clare, and guess who else has Swordcatcher by Cassandra Clare at number 7? This guy right here. Now, this is Cassandra Clare's first book outside of the Shadowhunter universe, and it follows like 3 main characters. We've got Kel, who is a sword catcher. He's an orphan boy who was adopted specifically to be a bodyguard or body double for the Crown Prince. So through magic, he can make himself appear to look exactly like the Crown Prince. And then if somebody tries to assassinate the Crown Prince at like a dinner or a public setting, then they're just gonna kill Kel instead, and everybody's happy because no one cares about orphan kids. Another perspective is Crown Prince Connor, and Connor would actually care if his best friend Kel got stabbed. So he's not really okay with the whole sword catcher thing, but he's happy that this poor orphan kid can grow up to be basically a prince too. Connor is a very typical YA crown prince where his father's a horrible king, but Connor's gonna do better, but he doesn't really understand what the people want, and he needs a young girl from the dregs of society to fall in love with and teach him how to be a true king. And that's where Lynn comes in. Lynn is from a nationality called Askar, and these people don't have their own homeland, but they have small sects inside a bunch of different city that are really like ghettos, like the Jewish type of ghetto. They're locked inside a specific area of a city and not allowed to like venture out after dark and have to follow all these like very extreme religious practices and like identifying markers and things like that. She is a physician. She is the only female physician and she's the best female physician, and she ends up having to work with Kell and Connor a lot because her grandfather like works for the king, and so she's come in to help Kell and Connor when they need medical assistance, but they don't want really everybody to know that they need medical assistance because of her her relationship with her grandfather means that she'll keep the secret, if that makes sense. There's also somebody known as the Rag Picker King, who's like the king of the criminals, and Kell and Lynn are both separately drawn into the underworld because of their past. Well, because of Kell's past and just because of who Lynn is. There's a bunch of intrigue and plots to overthrow the king and magic and stuff like that. If you like Cassandra Clare and you like the Shadowhunters, you might not like this. This is much slower paced and much more like typical high fantasy than the Shadowhunters novels. But if the story sounds interesting to you, I wouldn't stop you from reading it. I obviously enjoyed it since I put it at number 7, and it looks like most of the Goodreads people enjoyed it since they put it at number 7. Next up at number 6 is The Fragile Threads of Power by V.E. Schwab. I put this at number 12, but mostly because I haven't read the first 3 books in this series, and I had no idea what was going on. Oh, I don't want to talk a lot about this book because it's the 4th book in a series. This is the 4th book in the Darker Shade of Magic series. Darker Shade of Magic, I haven't read it, so I guess I can give you a summary as I know it, which is there are like multiple overlapping universes, and certain people can travel between the different Londons in all of these universes. And then you've got like magical Londons and evil Londons, and then our London, which has no magic. And that's all I know. And this book just continues that story with some old characters and some new characters, and definitely don't read this before you read the first 3, because A, you'll be confused, and B, you'll be spoiled for a lot of things like I was. And at number 5, Goodreads has Bookshops and Bone Dust, which was my number 1. Sad face. This follows Viv, who is the main character of Legends and Lattes, which came out last year. Yes, you can read this without reading Legends and Lattes because this happens when Viv was younger, so this is a prequel. So Viv is an orc warrior in a D&D campaign-like world, and she gets injured trying to fight this necromancer and has to like chill out and heal in this little town while the rest of her adventuring party goes out hunting this necromancer. And Viv is not very good at, chilling out. And she kind of just tries to find things to do in this town. She makes a lot of friends, helps save a bookstore, falls in love with a baker. It's a lovely sapphic story. It's cute, it's cuddly, it's a warm hug of a fantasy novel. I absolutely adored this, and I always adore Travis Baldry's writing. A lot of people say that they liked Legends and Lattes more, but I like this more because I like the bookshop. I'm a book girly here, so of course I like this one more. But definitely highly recommend if you want a hug in the form of a book. Speaking of book hugs, we got Emily Wilde's Encyclopedia of Fairies, which is also a book hug, but should have been in the romantasy category because this is literal fairy porn. This one's just warm and cuddly, so apparently if you're reading romantasy, it needs to be like a dark and abusive instead of warm and cuddly fairy porn. I don't know. This follows a professor at Cambridge named Emily Wilde, and she is the expert on fairies, and she's trying to write an encyclopedia. And so Emily travels to like a Nordic village to research some ice fairies. She's awkward, she's not great with people, maybe a little bit autistic. Yeah, she's she's good at research. She's not good at, like, you know, talking to humans. And then when her academic rival shows up to the same village, he is charming, he's award-winning, he is fantabulous, and he's also lazy and cheats on writing his papers, and so they clash a little bit. But this man is head over heels in love with Emily, and she's just like, huh? What? Where? Men? Never heard of him. But yeah, it's just a really cute story where he has fallen so much harder and so much faster than she has, and then she kind of gets herself in trouble a little bit with the fairies, because fairies aren't nice people. They're kind of evil. And it's just a sweet little hug of a book where this man is in love with her and she's in love with research. Highly recommend if you want fairy porn, but maybe want it a little bit sweeter this time. Number 3, A Day of Fallen Night by Samantha Shannon. I had this at 16. This is the prequel to Priory of the Orange Tree. I hated Priory of the Orange Tree. I think this story is boring, too long, doesn't need to exist, and was literally a copy-paste of Priory of the Orange Tree. I don't need to read 900 pages twice on a boring story. What this does do well is it is sapphic and queer. We have 4 perspectives. 2 are sapphic women, one's an asexual woman, and then one is a bisexual man. So if all you're looking for is 900 pages of queer fantasy, man, do I have a book for you. This is 500 years prior to the events of Priory of the Orange Tree, and we follow a sister of the Priory, a future queen, a future empress, and a cursed witch boy. As a volcano erupts and a bunch of dragons, evil fire dragons, spout out of this volcano, and these 4 people kind of have to survive or help their countries and their lands survive. They don't do anything. It just goes away on its own. But yeah, it was boring, but most people like this. The dislike is probably just me. At 2, Tress of the Emerald Sea, which I also had at 2. I agree with Brandon Sanderson. Again, a warm hug of a book. Tress of the Emerald Sea is a gender-bent retelling of The Princess Bride, where a young window washer named Tress is stuck on this island in the middle of the Emerald Sea. This fantasy world has a bunch of moons, and all of the moons just drop magic from the sky and turn most of the land into seas, depending on the color of the magic that the moon is dropping, specifically emerald in this case. But all of the magic is like ashes almost, and they're combustible, and if they touch water, they kind of explode into different things. So the problem is you don't want to get it in your eyes or on your skin, because humans are made of mostly water. Fortunately, these spores can be neutralized by silver, and so people just have a lot of silver on the land. The ash passes over it and dies. You don't have to worry about, you know, in the emerald world, a vine exploding out of your head if you get a little spore in your eye. Kind of a scary world, but a sweet story. Tress is in love with this nice boy named Charlie, and Charlie is the son of the Duke of the island that Tress lives on, but Charlie's father does not want his son, you know, marrying a window washer, so he sends Charlie away to find a new wife, and Charlie is also in love with Tress and kind of sabotages this whole find a new bride Tinder date thing he's going on, and kind of just makes it uncomfortable for all the women that he's meeting. And his father's like, screw you, screw this, I'm gonna just give you to this evil sorceress. So I don't get what I want, you don't get what you want either. Go die with this evil sorceress. And Tress is like, I need to save my man. And that's pretty much the story. She gets on a ship, she makes friends, comes up with a found family and goes to save her man from this evil sorceress in the Midnight Sea. This is also told from the perspective of this dude Hoyd, who is my favorite character from Brandon Sanderson's Cosmere, so that made it like even better for me. But as you can tell, pretty much everybody who's read this book loves it because it's fantastic and it's sweet and it's cute and it's another warm hug of a fantasy novel. And then number 1, Hellbent by Leigh Bardugo, which is the second book in the Alex Stern series. The first book, Ninth House, won in 2020, I think. So, yeah. This is dark academia, following this chick named Alex Stern, who can just happen to see ghosts. And Alex, due to her ability to see ghosts, has been recruited to work for the secret societies at Yale in the policing secret society. Alex is like a meth addict and she never finished high school, but they like fake off her records so she could go to Yale just so she could run the secret society. Like, they don't actually care about her or her academic anything. She's just useful because she can see ghosts. And so she's in her first year training, learning how to do this role for the secret societies, and her mentor like vanishes into hell, basically. And so the first book, she's trying to solve what happened to her mentor while trying to do her job that she's not trained for because her mentor disappears. This is fine. I'm not a huge dark academia fan, but I enjoyed that. Like, I like these books. I like reading them. I had this at 9, so it's kind of mid for me. Like, I'm going to continue on with the series. I have no problem reading this, but I'm just not a dark academia girly. But obviously, a lot of other people really like this book, so if you like dark academia, like, definitely pick up this series. You'll like it, but if you're not really into dark academia, it's still good, but it's not like this is the best book I've ever read in my entire life. Those were the 20 books for Goodreads Choice Fantasy this year. Let me know down in the comments below, did you read any of these? Have you read any of these? Are you going to read any of these? Have I changed your mind about any of these books? And I will see you tomorrow for another video. Tomorrow's video is going to be hella long, so I hope you're ready. Bye.